She was digging a well on her farm and thought she was just looking for water. But underground, she found a bathtub filled with concrete and bound with rusty chains. What was hidden inside should not have been buried for so long. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are from. The morning sun in Idaho was pale and slow to rise, spilling its light over the dry grass and the low wooden fences that divided the fields like tired scars. Ellie Moore stood at the kitchen window, her fingers wrapped around a chipped mug, the steam curling softly against the glass. The land outside had once been green and generous, back when her husband, Ben, still worked beside her. Now it was brittle and silent. The wind had a way of moving through it like breath through an empty chest. 7 years had passed since Ben died, yet the rhythm of the farm still carried his ghost. Every creak of the windmill, every smell of diesel, every dent in the old Caterpillar tractor reminded her of him. She had learned to do everything herself after he was gone. No one believed she would keep the place running. Neighbors had said she'd last 1 season before selling the land and moving closer to town. But Ellie was made of something that resisted surrender. She fixed the fences, replaced the pipes, balanced the feed accounts, and learned how to repair the well pump when it failed in the middle of the night. Her hands, calloused and strong, bore the story of those years more clearly than any diary could. She never remarried, never even thought about it. The farm was her vow now, one she'd keep until her body could no longer bear the weight of the work. The drought that summer had been the cruelest she could remember. The creek behind the barn had shrunk to a mere thread of mud, and the well that Ben had dug 40 years earlier had begun to wheeze and choke as if suffocating underground. Every morning the pump made a long metallic sigh, and Ellie could hear it through the walls, like the last breath of something that had once been alive. Without water, the cattle would have to be sold, and she could not face that. So, one morning, she decided to dig a new well herself. She drove her old pickup into town, past the cracked road and the faded billboard that promised better days ahead. The hardware store owner, a man named Cal, raised his eyebrows when she asked about renting an excavator. "That's a tough job, Ellie," he said. "You sure you want to do it alone?" She only nodded. Cal had known her long enough not to argue. By afternoon, a worn but functional yellow Caterpillar stood beside her barn, its metal skin reflecting the sun like the scales of some prehistoric beast. Ellie stood for a moment with her hands on her hips, watching the dust drift through the air. The machine looked heavy, stubborn, and ancient, exactly how she felt. She climbed into the seat, turned the key, and the engine came to life with a roar that shook the dry earth. The vibration ran through her bones, strange and familiar at once. As the bucket cut into the soil, she thought of Ben teaching her years ago how to measure depth, how to read the color of the dirt to know where the water might be hiding. He used to say, "The land remembers what it's given. You just have to dig where it wants you to." By noon, she had carved a deep wound into the earth. The sun burned her neck and arms, sweat stung her eyes, and still she kept going, stubborn against exhaustion. The rhythm of the machine lulled her into a trance, the scrape, the lift, the dump, the thud of falling dirt. Then, suddenly, the bucket struck something hard. The sound was metallic, hollow, and wrong. She stopped the engine, the silence around her thick and ringing. At first, she thought she had hit an old oil drum or a rusted pipe. Kneeling at the edge of the pit, she brushed the dirt away with her hands. Her fingertips met something smooth and curved, caked in rust and soil. She kept digging until she saw the outline. A bathtub, cast iron, heavy and ancient. It lay buried upright, sealed over with a layer of gray concrete. Thick, rusted chains were looped tightly around it, as if someone had meant to bind it shut forever. A strange unease crawled through her. She sat back on her heels, staring at the grotesque object half exposed in the pit. Who would bury a bathtub in the middle of a field? And why the chains? The air felt different now, heavier, like the field itself was holding its breath. Ellie climbed out of the pit, brushing dust from her jeans. She told herself it was probably just some old trash from before the Moors bought the property. People buried strange things in the war years. Maybe it was full of scrap metal or broken machinery. Still, as she walked back toward the house, she found herself looking over her shoulder again and again, as though something unseen might rise from that hole if she turned away for too long. That night, the wind blew harder than usual, whistling through the cracked windows. The dog, Jess, barked at nothing, pacing the porch with her hackles raised. Ellie tried to sleep, but every time she closed her eyes, she saw the shape of that bathtub buried in the earth, the coils of chain glinting faintly under her flashlight. Around midnight, she got up, put on her boots, and went outside with a lantern. The field shimmered under the half-moon. The excavator sat like a sleeping animal beside the hole. She stood at the edge and peered down. The beam of light fell across the concrete surface, and for a moment, she imagined she heard something, a faint echo, or perhaps only her own heartbeat, drumming against the silence. The next morning, she couldn't stand it any longer. Curiosity, that old enemy of reason, began to whisper. She brought her hammer and began chipping at the concrete. The blows echoed across the fields, dull and stubborn. After an hour, she had barely scratched the surface. She fetched her sledgehammer. The sweat rolled down her back, mixing with dust, until she could taste grit on her lips. The hammer rang out again and again, but the concrete refused to break. By evening, her arms ached, and her shoulders burned. She sat on the edge of the pit, staring at her failure. There was something about that sealed tub that gnawed at her mind. She imagined stories, perhaps stolen money, or some old weapon, or even a hidden time capsule. Ben would have told her to leave it alone, to call the sheriff, but Ben was gone, and the land was hers to answer to now. The following day, she drove back into town and bought an electric jackhammer with the last of her savings. Cal tried to make small talk, but she didn't explain what it was for. When she returned home, she rolled up her sleeves and started again. The sound was deafening this time, a relentless metallic scream that rattled through her skull. Jess barked and retreated to the porch, tail tucked low. Bits of concrete began to crack and flake away. After hours of work, a dark hollow opened beneath her, and the smell that escaped made her gag earth, rust, and something older, sour and metallic. The final layer broke suddenly, and the jackhammer slipped from her hands. She froze. Beneath the broken concrete lay a fragment of fabric, greenish-brown, rotted, but still recognizable as a uniform. Buttons glinted faintly in the light. She knelt, trembling, brushing away the dust until she saw it clearly. Bones, white and dry, curled inside the tub. A skull rested against the iron rim, its hollow eyes fixed on nothing. Ellie stumbled backward, heart hammering. For a long time she couldn't breathe. Her thoughts scattered like frightened birds. She wanted to call someone, but who? The sheriff would close the field. The government might take the land for evidence, and the farm would be ruined. She crouched again, forcing herself to look closer. The remains were old decades at least. On the chest lay a small metal tag with Japanese characters, and between the bones of the hands, something thin and brittle was clutched. A letter. It was wrapped in oilcloth, preserved better than it had any right to be. She peeled the covering away with shaking fingers. The paper inside was yellowed, the ink faded, but still legible enough to make out a few shapes. She took it inside, laid it on the kitchen table beneath the lamp, and snapped a picture with her phone. The translation app struggled, but words began to appear on the screen. My name is Kenji Ishikawa. If you find me, please bury me in Japan. I wish to go home." Ellie stared at the glowing screen for a long time. Outside, the windmill creaked, the night thickened, and Jess began to whimper by the door. The house felt smaller, the air tighter. She sat down, head in her hands, torn between fear and something else. Pity, perhaps, or the ache of recognition. This man, whoever he was, had been someone's husband, someone's son. Lost in a war that had swallowed millions. And now, 70 years later, his voice was reaching out from under her land, asking only to go home. She could not decide what to do. If she called the authorities, they would take over everything. If she kept silent, she would be betraying the dead. When dawn finally came, pale and thin through the kitchen curtains, she made her choice. She walked back out to the field, shovel in hand, and began to cover the hole again. The chains clinked faintly as the dirt fell, like the last words of someone she'd never met. She worked until her arms shook, until the earth looked unbroken again. But that night, she couldn't sleep. The letter lay on the table, and the words seemed to glow faintly in the lamplight. The sound of the wind outside grew restless, tapping at the windows, whispering through the cracks in the boards. She thought she heard a voice, a whisper that might have been the house, or the trees, or something deeper. "Home," it said, in a voice that might have been her own. Ellie sat up, staring at the darkened window. In the reflection, she saw her own face, and behind it, the faint outline of the field beyond. She knew then that the story was not finished, and that burying the truth would never make it stay buried. The earth might keep its secrets, but only for a while. Something beneath it was waiting, and sooner or later, she would have to answer. The following days passed in a haze of silence and half-sleep. The field looked the same as before, as if nothing had been disturbed. But Ellie could no longer look at it without feeling something shift inside her chest. Every time the wind passed over the dry soil, she thought she heard a whisper from beneath it. Faint, but insistent. At night, she kept seeing the letter in her mind, the delicate paper, the careful strokes of the foreign writing, the trembling plea for a home across the sea. She had buried the bones, but not the memory, and she understood that some things, once uncovered, refused to go back to sleep. She tried to return to her routines, feeding the cows, checking the fences, repairing the shed roof where the storm had torn through the tin. Yet everything around her felt strangely fragile now, as if the entire farm were only pretending to be alive. Jess followed her everywhere, restless and alert, barking at corners of the yard for no reason Ellie could see. The dog's unease made her own fear harder to ignore. She caught herself listening to the ground sometimes, wondering if the earth itself was breathing. One evening, she sat at her kitchen table, the light from a single bulb casting long shadows over the floorboards. The letter lay folded beside her coffee cup. She hadn't had the heart to rebury it. Instead, she'd taken it from her safe that morning, telling herself she only wanted to look at it one last time before burning it. But she couldn't bring herself to strike a match. The words were too human, too alive. She picked up her phone, took another photo of the letter, and opened the translation app again, trying to fill in the lines where the first attempt had faltered. The sentences emerged, broken, but haunting. "My name is Kenji Ishikawa. I was not your enemy. If you find me, please send me home. I want to rest where my mother waits." Ellie stared at the screen. There was something painfully simple about the plea. No anger, no bitterness, just a tired man asking for peace. The thought of leaving him under her field, faceless and unnamed, began to feel like a sin. After another hour of hesitation, she opened her laptop and searched for Kenji Ishikawa World War II. The screen filled with results in Japanese, some old military lists, some forgotten archives. She couldn't read most of them, but the name appeared again and again. She decided to post one photo, just one, in a history forum she'd once joined, to ask about an antique plow. Her message was short. "I found this letter buried on my property. Can anyone tell me what it says?" By morning, the post had dozens of comments. Some called it a hoax, others demanded proof, and a few offered translations more fluent than any app could manage. One user wrote in careful English, "This name is from a list of missing Japanese soldiers. He was stationed near the Aleutian Islands in 1943, never found." Another message came later. "He was young, 23. His family in Osaka never recovered his body." "How did you find him?" Ellie sat staring at the words until her coffee went cold. The idea that someone halfway across the world might still be waiting for news of this man 70 years later felt unreal. She turned off the computer and went outside, hoping the cold air would steady her. The morning sky was a thin gray, the wind sharp. The land around her looked endless, indifferent, and yet she felt its gaze, heavy and knowing. She had unearthed something the earth itself might have preferred to keep. 2 days later, a dark SUV appeared at the end of her driveway. Ellie saw it from her porch while she was oiling the hinges of the barn door. The vehicle moved slowly, too carefully, before coming to a stop beside her truck. 2 men stepped out, dressed in dark suits that didn't belong on a farm road. One was tall, his shoes shining absurdly against the dust. The other shorter, carrying a thin briefcase. "Mrs. Moore?" the tall one said, smiling with his mouth, but not his eyes. "We're with the Federal Historical Commission. You made a discovery that falls under our department's concern." Ellie wiped her hands on her jeans and said nothing. The shorter man spoke next, his voice smooth. "We understand you found human remains of foreign origin. If that's correct, the government needs to take custody immediately." "I already buried it back," she replied. "That's all right," he said quickly. "We only need to collect some materials records, perhaps the letter you mentioned online." Her stomach tightened. "And what if I say no?" The taller man chuckled softly. "Then, ma'am, I'm afraid you might be interfering with a federal investigation." He glanced toward the field, eyes narrow as if he could see through the soil. "We can offer compensation. Say, $20,000 for cooperation." Ellie folded her arms. "Show me identification." They exchanged a brief look. The shorter one reached into his jacket and flashed something that looked official, but too quickly for her to read. It might have been a driver's license for all she knew. She stared at him until the smile faded from his face. "I don't sell graves," she said quietly. There was a long pause before they turned back toward the car. "If you change your mind, Mrs. Moore, you have our number," the tall one said, leaving a card on the porch rail. When she looked down later, she saw that the card was blank on one side, and the other only had a local phone number without a name or agency. That night, headlights swept across her window around midnight. She peeked through the curtains and saw the same SUV parked by the gate. It stayed for a long minute before pulling away. Jess growled softly from her spot on the rug. Ellie didn't sleep again until morning. The following day, Sheriff Collins stopped by, his hat low over his eyes. "Got a report saying you might have some kind of dangerous material buried on your land," he said. "You doing all right out here, Ellie?" "Dangerous material," she repeated. He shrugged. "Probably nothing. You know how rumors go. But folks get nervous when the word war comes up." She nodded, forcing a smile. "Nothing dangerous here, Sheriff. Just dry dirt and bad memories." When he left, she felt her knees go weak. Whoever those men were, they had connections. The air around the farm no longer felt like home. It felt like a stage watched by unseen eyes. That evening, she dug a shallow pit behind the shed and hid the letter inside an old mason jar. She buried it deep, covering it with a rusted sheet of metal and a pile of wood so no one could guess. For a while, things went quiet. The online post faded from view, buried by new discussions. She stopped checking her messages, stopped going into town. But the silence didn't last. One afternoon, while she was mending a broken fence post, her phone vibrated. A message, written in careful English. "Mrs. Moore, my name is Kazuo Takahashi. I'm a journalist from Osaka. I saw the photo you shared and would like to help translate the letter. It may belong to a man whose family is still alive." She hesitated for hours before replying. Finally, she sent a short message. "Yes, it's real. I can show you the letter, but it's old and fragile." Within minutes, he responded, "Please, don't move it. I can translate from your photo." That night, they spoke over a video call. The man on the screen had kind eyes and a small apartment filled with books behind him. When Ellie showed him the letter, his voice grew softer. "This handwriting," he said, "it's very careful. Soldiers often wrote these farewell letters before missions. But this one, it's different. It says, 'I have seen enough death. I do not wish to be remembered as a soldier. I wish to return to my mother.'" Ellie felt something twist in her chest. So he knew he would die? Perhaps. Or he hoped someone would show mercy. Many never did. Kazuo looked up at her through the screen. "You found him by chance, but maybe you were meant to. In my country, we say that bones call to those who can hear them." She didn't sleep that night either. The words followed her into her dreams. She saw a man in a tattered uniform standing in the wheat field, his face half-shadowed by the rising sun. He held a folded paper to his chest and mouthed something she couldn't hear. When she woke, tears had soaked her pillow. Kazuo published a short article about the discovery, including her permission to use only her initials. Within days, her farm's name spread across both American and Japanese media. Journalists called, local TV stations drove out to the gate, and neighbors stopped by under the guise of kindness, but with eyes full of questions. Ellie stopped answering her phone altogether. She thought about deleting the post, but it was too late. The story had grown wings. One afternoon, an envelope arrived in the mail with foreign stamps. Inside was a letter written in precise handwriting. "Dear Mrs. Moore, my name is Haruto Ishikawa. I am the great-grandson of Kenji Ishikawa. My family and I have searched for his remains for many years. If possible, I would like to visit you and bring him home." Ellie sat at the kitchen table, reading the letter over and over. The world outside seemed to fade, leaving only the sound of the clock ticking on the wall. She thought about the two men who had come to her door, about the government's silence, about the eyes of the man in her dream. Perhaps this was the ending he had asked for. Not silence, not secrecy, but recognition. When she replied, her words were brief and steady. "You are welcome to come. He's waiting." The next morning, she walked out to the field again. The dirt was hard beneath her boots, cracked from the heat, but she knew where the ground had once been soft. She stood there a long time, the wind catching her hair, and whispered into the emptiness, "You're going home soon, Kenji." The air stirred, gentle as a sigh. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled across the horizon, a sound like the beginning of something new. The sky over Boise was a soft gray the morning Haruto Ishikawa arrived, the kind of sky that promised neither rain nor sun, but carried the quiet expectancy of change. Ellie waited by the arrival gate, her hands clasped around the worn leather straps of her purse. She wasn't used to airports, to the polished floors and the hum of languages blending together, to the smell of coffee and jet fuel. She felt out of place among the rushing travelers in their sleek shoes and shining devices. She had thought more than once on the drive that this entire trip might have been a mistake. But when the crowd parted and she saw him, Tall, neat, his dark suit pressed, his eyes bright but solemn. Her doubts began to settle. He walked toward her with the calm grace of someone raised to carry tradition in every movement. "Mrs. Moore?" he asked. His accent was light, but the sound of her name in his voice felt foreign, reverent. She nodded, extending her hand. "Haruto." It was not a question, but an acknowledgement. He bowed slightly before shaking her hand, his expression gentle. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," he said. "You have done something no one in my family could for 3 generations." They spoke little on the drive back to the farm. The road stretched endlessly between dry fields and faded barns, and every few miles, Haruto looked out the window as though trying to memorize the shape of the land. Ellie caught him watching the horizon once, his lips moving in silent Japanese. She wondered if he was praying. The radio played softly, an old country song about home and forgiveness, and though neither of them mentioned it, the word home hung between them like a fragile truth. Neither dared to break. When they reached the farm, Haruto stepped out of the truck and stood still for a long moment, taking in the expanse of it, the yellowing grass, the sagging fences, the quiet dignity of the place. "It's beautiful," he said at last, and Ellie almost laughed at the idea. "It's dry," she corrected. "But it's honest." He smiled faintly. "That is another kind of beauty." Inside the house, she poured them coffee, and he unfolded a small packet from his bag. "This is from my mother," he said. "Green tea from Kyoto. She wanted me to bring it as thanks." The delicate paper wrapping and the faint scent of the tea leaves seemed too fine for her rough kitchen. Ellie placed it carefully on the table, unsure of what to do with such a gift. "Please tell her I appreciate it," she said, and Haruto nodded, his eyes softening. After they had finished their drinks, Ellie led him out to the field. The day was warm, the wind restless, tugging at the hem of her jacket as they walked. When they reached the spot, she stopped and turned toward him. "He's here," she said quietly. "I didn't move him again. I thought it should be for his family to decide." Haruto knelt in the dirt, pressing his hand gently to the ground. He said something in Japanese, a short phrase that seemed to carry both apology and relief. When he looked up, his eyes glistened. "Thank you," he whispered. "You kept your promise, even when it wasn't yours to keep." Ellie didn't know what to say, so she simply nodded, her throat tight. Over the next 2 days, preparations for a small ceremony began. Haruto arranged for a translator, a local priest, and a few members of the Japanese consulate to attend. Neighbors offered chairs and flowers. The sheriff stopped by with his hat in his hands, awkward and quiet, to apologize for the trouble he'd caused months earlier. "Didn't know what you were into, Ellie," he said, his voice rough. "Guess I owe you more than one sorry." She smiled faintly. "You were doing your job, Sheriff. Now let me do mine." When the morning of the ceremony arrived, the air was still and heavy, as if the land itself waited. Ellie wore her cleanest shirt and brushed the dust from her boots. Haruto dressed in black, his jacket sharp against the pale sky. A small crowd gathered. Farmers, reporters, a few curious locals. But as the priest began to speak, all sound seemed to fall away. The Japanese translator's voice trembled slightly as she read the words of the letter aloud, the same ones Ellie had once struggled to translate on her phone. "I do not wish to be remembered as an enemy. I wish to rest beside my mother. If you find me, please send me home." The simplicity of it filled the silence with something sacred. The crowd lowered their heads. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of hay and dust across the field. Ellie's eyes burned, but she did not wipe them. She thought of Ben then, how he'd fought in another war, how he too had buried pieces of himself that never came back. The thought that this stranger's bones could find peace while so many others still wandered unsettled her. Yet it also gave her a strange sense of balance, as though she had finally witnessed something being set right. After the ceremony, Haruto approached her with a small wooden box lined in silk. Inside lay the folded letter and a few fragments of the uniform's buttons. "These will go home with me," he said softly. "The rest will be buried properly there. You have done more than we could ever repay." He reached into his bag again and handed her a sealed envelope. "Please, take this. It is from my family. We insist." Ellie opened it later, alone in her kitchen. The number written on the check made her breath catch, but it wasn't the money that broke her. It was the note tucked beside it, written in neat, careful English. "For keeping a promise made before you were born." She sat there for a long time, the envelope in her lap, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock, and the quiet beating of her heart. The next morning, Haruto knocked gently at her door. In his arms was a small bundle of furfaw, with bright eyes, and a tail that wagged shyly. "This is Yuki," he said, "from my family's line of Akitas. In Japan, they are a symbol of loyalty and remembrance. We hope he will guard your home as you guarded ours." Ellie smiled through her tears. "That's a big responsibility for a little dog." Haruto laughed softly. "He will grow. They always do." When he left, she stood by the porch, watching the car disappear down the dirt road, a trail of dust rising like smoke behind it. The field was silent again, but no longer lonely. The wind carried the faint echo of voices, of languages she didn't understand, but somehow felt she knew. She looked down at the puppy, who sat beside her boot, watching the same horizon. "Welcome home, Yuki," she murmured. The following months moved slower, softer. Ellie used part of the money to repair the barn roof, and the rest to transform the old storage shed into a small museum. She called it Voices of the Earth. Inside, she placed the photographs of the letter, the translation, and a map showing where the Aleutian Islands met the Pacific winds. She added other relics found around the county rusted dog tags, faded photos, trinkets from soldiers whose stories had been lost to time. It wasn't grand, just one room with wooden shelves and quiet light. But people came. School groups, travelers, even veterans, who stood silently before the display and left flowers at the door. The museum became more than a project. It became a way for her to live with the memory instead of against it. Some evenings, she would sit inside after closing, the lights dim, Yuki curled by her feet, and she would talk softly to the air, telling Kenji about the seasons, about how the drought had finally broken, about how his story had brought strangers together who might never have met. She didn't know if he heard her, but it comforted her to speak. Winter came early that year. Snow blanketed the fields, muffling every sound. Ellie shoveled the porch, her breath rising in small clouds, and when she looked across the land, it seemed peaceful again, wrapped in white as if finally allowed to rest. She walked to the spot where the ceremony had been held. A small wooden marker stood there now, its inscription carved in both English and Japanese. He went home. Standing there, she felt a calm she hadn't known in years. The house, the land, even her memories of Benall seemed lighter, freer. Perhaps, she thought, the act of returning someone home had returned a part of herself too. She reached down and brushed the snow from the base of the marker, her gloved hand lingering for a moment. "You made it," she whispered, "and maybe so did I." That evening, she sat on the porch as the sun sank behind the hills. The puppy had grown, his coat thick against the cold. He lay beside her chair, head resting on her boot, eyes half closed. The air smelled faintly of pine and smoke from a distant chimney. Ellie lifted her mug of tea, the same green tea Haruto's mother had sent, and took a slow sip. The warmth spread through her, gentle and steady. Far beyond the fields, a plane moved across the twilight sky, its lights blinking faintly. She imagined Haruto on another flight somewhere over the Pacific, carrying the bones of his ancestor back to the soil that had waited for him for nearly a century. Somewhere, oceans apart, a mother's grave would finally have her son beside her. Ellie watched until the sky swallowed the last trace of light, until the stars came out one by one, quiet and patient. "You're home now," she said again, her voice barely a whisper. The dog stirred, pressing closer to her leg, and the sound of the wind through the grass answered her softly, as if in agreement. For the first time in a long while, Ellie Moore felt that the earth beneath her feet was not just keeping secrets, it was keeping promises. And in that quiet space between the past and the present, where stories met the soil, she found that home was not always a place, but the peace that comes when what was lost has finally been returned. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe and watch the next videos. More true stories are coming soon. And don't forget to share this video so others can see it too.